All right, gang, here we go. We're going to go ahead and go into our second lesson for biochemistry, which is going to be about the elements of life. So the first one about water was very, very lengthy. This one's actually going to be relatively shorter. So, again, as normally, we're going to go ahead and go through our essential knowledges, and then we'll get right into the material. We're going to take a look real fast. The first thing that this is really focusing on is that organisms must exchange matter with the environment to grow, reproduce, and maintain organization. The whole purpose of this specific lesson is to talk about how it is that the organisms actually get the stuff, right? So, like you think about you, right? Here you are. How is it that you get the matter that you're able to grow, reproduce, and maintain, right? Well, you end up eating food, right? So the idea is like, okay, well, you end up eating food. Well, not every single thing is going to eat food, right? Plants, they don't end up eating food. They instead do photosynthesis. They will absorb nutrients from the ground through assimilation. Other things don't eat. We have things that will decompose. I guess they end up eating like stuff, but they end up decomposing stuff. So we'll end up going into these different nutrient cycles. So there's a little bit of ecology into this one. Atoms and molecules from the environment are necessary to build new molecules. We are going to spend a lot of time talking about this guy, carbon. Carbon is by far the most important atom when it comes down to building these molecules because it makes all of our biomolecules, our carbs, our proteins, our lipids, and our nucleic acids. We're going to be explaining specifically how it's able to go ahead and do that. The other focus is going to be about nitrogen. So we will use nitrogen in order to go create nucleic acids and proteins. And then phosphorus is going to be used to make nucleic acids and certain lipids, specifically your phospholipids. Well, make sure that you end up hearing about what the important elements are, and let's just get right into it. This periodic table actually looks good. It makes me really happy to be able to see it. So let's go ahead and get some stuff here to go take a look at. All right. Elements, right? An element's pure substance. What we're really focusing on are these guys right here. Okay. Carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, phosphorus, nitrogen, sulfur. You can go ahead and write these guys down. When you ended up learning about this, probably in your biology class, right? You should have learned about the carbon cycle. You probably heard about the nitrogen cycle. You may or may not have gone through the phosphorus cycle and then also the water cycle. Well, hey, keep in mind, water is hydrogen and oxygen, right? So you're probably thinking like, wait a second, how does sulfur get around? Well, we end up getting sulfur from other ways, right? We end up eating food and such, so we get them. But the thing that I want to keep in mind, or at least make you aware of, is that this is the stuff you're primarily made out of, right? Now, keep in mind, you have hemoglobin, so you got iron and all this other nonsense that's inside of you, right? That's actually everything that's looking up into here is the stuff that we're going to go ahead and see or have or, what have you, right? You got like calcium locating your bones. You have sodium, potassium pumps, right? Find sodium right here, right? So you have those that are used within your nervous system or other stuff, right? This stuff is important, but really we want to focus on these guys right here. All right, that is the goal for this little lesson right here. All right, so let's go ahead and talk about how the stuff ends up getting around. Probably the most common one, or the one that you spent a lot of time with during your time of biology, is the carbon cycle, right? So in the case here for the carbon cycle, you may want to just jot this down or find this picture, maybe print it out, cut it out, and put it into your notebook so you have access to it, right? What I'm going to go do is just kind of draw an arrow to show where the carbon may begin with, and then we go from there. So I personally like starting at atmospheric carbon dioxide, right? So this carbon dioxide is going to go ahead and be absorbed by plants, right? And with the use of sunlight. Sunlight is not carbon, right? It's not, it's just energy, right? Keep in mind, this is energy. This is not actually carbon. The energy from the sun and carbon dioxide will help make glucose, and that's going to be a form of organic compound or organic carbon. It also makes starch and some other stuff, and it's great, right? Wonderful. All right, well, in the case here, this can end up dying and eventually can become a fossil or oil or something of that nature. We'll get around to those guys in a bit. Normally, though, what's a perfect world is that the plant is going to be eaten by some kind of animal, right? And the animal eats it, and then we end up eating the animal, right? Perfect. So that's kind of explaining how you end up getting some of the carbon, right? Or how you actually get your carbon, right? You do not absorb from the atmosphere, you eat stuff, everything's fine. The animal is going to respire. It's a fancy way of saying that it's going to go use energy and breathe, and that carbon dioxide can be absorbed by plants or it can go back into the atmosphere, right? Perfect fine. Even look, even the plant's going to be able to do respiration, right? Both these guys are going to go do cellular respiration. They'll go use glucose. They can make carbon dioxide. Just what's neat about the plant is that it's able to actually, take in that carbon dioxide again. Now, if stuff ends up dying, it can be stored as a fossil fuel. We can also end up, or sorry, as a fossil or fossil fuel. And if we are lucky, and if we'd like to go ahead and burn this stuff, we can go ahead and take it to a factory, and then we can burn those fossils and fossil fuels and put more atmospheric carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Right. Not really a good time. Let's see normally how it's going. The ocean is a location that we end up having some carbon, but this is primarily how carbon is cycled around, really. All right. It's mostly taken in by plants from the atmosphere. All right, I'll go ahead and just summarize that, do that maybe in a different color so we can keep track. All right, so we're going to take a look, right? So in the case here, the plant, get out of here, come on. The plant will absorb the carbon dioxide. It'll end up being eaten by an animal. They will either die or they'll go ahead and release the carbon dioxide where it can be absorbed by the plants or it goes up into the atmosphere. Any of these fossils right here, fuels, they can go to a factory, be burned, and we add more carbon dioxide that we end up seeing right there. Okay, so the sun's driving this whole thing. As long as we have carbon available, we are good to go. The next one that I'm going to go and take a look at is going to be the nitrogen cycle, and then we'll quickly touch on the phosphorus cycle. Now, what's nitrogen's a little bit weird because there's we're adding bacteria to the mix at this point, right? So let's kind of show how this goes. We start here at atmospheric nitrogen, right? So I'm going to pause this, take the get this picture. You're going to kind of be familiar with how this stuff goes around, right? Nitrogen. It ends up, first of all, being absorbed by bacteria that is going to be found within the ground, right? This is actually a very easy one to follow. So from here, lightning will hit the ground. This nitrogen fixing bacteria is going to, grab that nitrogen. Everything's happy. It's great, wonderful. Well, the plant will end up absorbing this into the roots, and then it's going to use that nitrogen, right? So that's where the nitrogen is coming from. The nitrogen can end up turning into ammonia, and then it can end up being denitrified or nitrified into nitrates, right? Into nitrates, and basically the nitrogen is just constantly changing its identity, almost in a way, whether it's attached to hydrogens or attached to oxygens, what have you. It's just doing its thing. The denitrifying bacteria will end up releasing this nitrogen back into the atmosphere, right? So what ends up happening, right, primarily is that this is like almost like a big cycle right here, where this nitrogen is going to be, absorbed by bacteria, release, and what have you. This inner circle, right? So I'm going to go ahead and change this to another color so we're still playing, right? If you go take a look, the plant can absorb, right, that nitrogen. Now it's using it. It's using it as part of its DNA and what have you. Well, an animal can go ahead and eat it, right? Exactly makes sense, right? So this is how that's how the animal gets its nitrogen. It's going to eat it. We call this is the process of assimilation. You're like making it like part of you, right? Well, if the plant ends up dying, right, animal ends up dying, decomposers, they're going to go ahead and break down whatever nitrogen molecules that are there, and then it goes back into this big loop of it going to the bacteria, eventually going up to the atmosphere and what have you. So that's how nitrogen gets cycled around. Phosphorus cycle, I really don't want to spend a lot of time on here. If you understand the nitrogen cycle, more or less the phosphorus cycle works the exact same way. The only difference between here is that your phosphorus is not going to end up becoming a gas. It does not end up becoming a gas at all because, well, phosphorus takes a lot of energy to become a liquid. And then from a liquid, you put more stuff into it, then it becomes a gas. So in the case here, you're never going to go and see this. Phosphorus is pretty much always going to be a solid. So it's just solid compounds that are always being interacted with. So the animal manure will go into the ground. It'll eventually be uptake by the plants. Where crop harvest it, right? You'll end up eating the plant. You eat things that have phosphorus in it. So really, it's the exact same like process that's happening there, right? So it's just not going up into the atmosphere. It's just always going to have some kind of solid identity to it. In the case here, it's going to be like lots of fertilizers and stuff. If you go to the local hardware store, Lowe's or Home Depot, what have you, fertilizers have lots and lots and lots of phosphorus in it. And the reason why phosphorus is good is that phosphorus is used, and we'll talk about it, it's going to go and make those nucleic acids. So what you're doing is that you're providing materials in order to go make DNA that allows for more genes to be created. They could be copied in order to go make new cells. It also allows us to have the nucleic acids to make RNA that helps us out and to make proteins eventually. So what you're doing is that you're kickstarting these organisms and being able to allow them to create stuff to promote them living. Right. We're not going to go into the water cycle. It's not something we need to really worry about, but this kind of gives you a little bit of an idea on, again, right? How is it that the carbon, the phosphorus, the nitrogen ends up going around? As the case of oxygen and hydrogen, what's interesting is that oxygen and hydrogen is almost attached to any organic molecule that you're going to go ahead and see. All right, so then we'll see that in a couple of organisms. Okay, now, why is it that we spend a lot of time with nutrient cycles? Not only do you need to be aware of it, but it helps you out in being able to understand how stuff transfers from one to another, right? So there's energy transfer, and really, not only is there energy transfer, there's matter transfer, right? We end up talking about these trophic pyramids. You may have remembered that it says like this is the most, right? Biomass is located right here, and then you have the least biomass there. What that means is like basically like if you think about this, right? What do you think that there's more of? Do you think there's more grass, or do you think that there's more rabbits, in a given ecosystem? It's not supposed to be a trick question. There's going to be way more grass, right? Because there needs to be enough of this food, enough of this matter in order to go and feed these rabbits right here. And then eventually we go and take a look at these rabbits, right? We have rabbits or snakes. What is there going to be more of? Well, obviously, there's going to be more rabbits because the snakes need the rabbits in order to go and live. So if there's less rabbits, there's less snakes, and we can kind of see how this trend goes up in there, right? So the least biomass means that the least amount of things that are making biological life, the most amount of biological life. Okay, so anything that's like a producer, there's going to be lots and lots and lots and lots of producers to be able to sustain these consumers that go up here and here and here. So these trophic pyramids, not only do you have most biomass, we talk about energy, right? So the energy, this is going to be where the most energy is going to be located. The least amount of energy will be up there. And then we can even talk about population, how population will will end up decreasing, right? It decreases as you go up. It decreases because there's less and less things. Like basically, these hawks are competing for each other to go and eat the snakes that are right there. These snakes are competing with each other to, get these rabbits right there, and these rabbits are competing in order to go and get all that grass, right? There's not enough resources for everybody, right? Now, what we want to kind of consider, right? Why is that we end up eating and stuff? Well, it's, you think like, oh, I'm hungry. I need to do stuff. Well, you're constantly doing chemical reactions within your body. Even though you're breathing and you're listening to me talk, your brain is, using the sodium potassium pumps to fire off their neurons, and you're letting certain chemical reactions take place, right? That takes energy, that takes resources, so we need to replenish those resources, right? Your cells are constantly going through osmosis, where they are gaining water, losing water, in order to maintain some level of homeostasis to keep them at a stable environment. So you need to go and drink that water in order to go and replenish it. So really, the reason why you eat and drink water and breathe, you're trying to keep like the 300 trillion cells that are inside of you alive, right? Like it's kind of wild to think about. I'm like, oh, 300 trillion. I'm not even. Yeah, I was about to say. I was like, I wasn't even up there yet. Yeah, you have like all these cells that need the food. They need proteins, right? So if you need to make new proteins to make the cells work, you eat protein, you eat, beef or beans or whatever in order to go and replenish it. So really, it's keeping all your cells alive, and it's kind of wild to think about. This is where we're going to go and talk a little bit about carbon, and we're kind of getting towards like the end of the little lesson, okay? Carbon is in every organic. It's like literally why we call it organic chemistry or organic science is means that there's carbon into it, okay? It is the backbone, which means is that it just serves as what we normally build everything else out of, right? If you remember, I said that hydrogen and oxygen are also very, very common. Well, hydrogen is like almost like a placeholder that shows up freaking everywhere. So you're going to see hydrogens all over the place, and then you're also going to start to see these oxygens showing up all over the place as well. All right, so that's kind of by design, right? Water can end up being helped in order to go and use this, but mostly the food that you consume. This right here is glucose right here. This glucose right here has oxygen located within it. And it's all good. Okay. Now, why carbon is useful? They don't have this in this presentation, but I'm just going to let you know. Time and chemistry. Carbon has 4 valence electrons, right? There's a 6 periodic table number, or the atomic number is 6, has 2 in its inner shell, 4 in its valence shell, right? Well, these 4 valence electrons allow it to make up the 4 connections, right? And we see that, take a look at this carbon right here. Let me do this in another color so we can kind of keep track of what's actually happening. I feel like I'm starting to get a little busy on here. We go take a look, right? Notice how this carbon has 4 lines, 1, 2, 3, 4. That's because it's able to make 4 connections because these 4 valence electrons right there. It's also able to go make these really cool double bonds. So if we go take a look at this right here, right? If we look at this carbon, you should see that it looks like this. It's attached to a carbon here, attached to an oxygen, and you got that guy right there. Well, what's happening here is if I go and take a look at this image, this carbon's attached to that carbon. This one's attached to this oxygen, but it's kind of like this oxygen right here is sharing 2 of those connections right there. So that's why we see the certain things right there. So carbon's super useful because it's just able to make lots of connections. You see 4 connections right there, see 4 connections right there, and everything's good to go. In some cases, you might be looking at some molecules and you might be like, wait a second, there's an OH, so how does that work? We kind of get lazy. It means that the oxygen is connected to the hydrogen, and that's that. There's going to be other molecules that we'll take a look at, and I'll show you this in a couple of other pictures up here, where we just don't even draw the hydrogens because we're just that lazy about it. But it's kind of like you should just be aware that it's there. If you don't see it, just make an assumption. Now, because carbon is incredible, it has those 4 valence electrons in the outer shell, we can make some really funky shapes with it, okay? You're going to take a look at biochemistry. They talk about all these different shapes. This tetrahedron, this is just the generic shape that carbon's going to go ahead and make, right? So if carbon's like right here, your hydrogen's going to be over there, right? And it makes that a tetrahedral shape. What's also really cool about carbon is that it's able to make these rings. So these are just showing you these rings right here, and you're probably thinking like, well, let's make these rings different. Well, if I have 5 carbons here in the middle, it's going to make like a pentagon-like shape, right? So cyclopentane, like pentagon. You see this cyclohexane as a hexagon. Oh, that's pretty cool. Benzene rings, they're pretty neat. I'm a big fan of them. Basically, what we do instead of just having all single bonds, we start to do double bonds every now and then. So we'll see benzene rings all over the place. And then pyridine, in the case here, well, let's replace this carbon right here with a nitrogen. So it's some pretty cool stuff. So hey, remember I tell you about the structure determines function? The shape determines its function. Why? Keep in mind, let's go back to the electron affinity, right? How is this guy? I'm going to go ahead and reset, right? Let's go back to electron affinity. How is this guy going to be different from this guy in terms of the electrons? Who do you think is going to be having the electrons a lot more in a certain location? It's going to be that nitrogen right there, right? The pyridine. Why? Because again, remember that the periodic trend, right? If we go and take a chat about it, right? It gets more electron affinity as we get to the top right, and since nitrogen is to the right of carbon, the nitrogen is going to be a little bit more negative, which means this area is going to be a little bit more positive, right? While this guy right here, this is going to be really more non-polar, because everything's going to be more or less being shared equally for this. Like you're going to see like a lot of patterns right there. So that means that this benzene and this pyridine, they're going to interact with things differently because that there is, right? Because that there is this negative sign right here, right? That negative sign right there, that's going to cause it to interact with something that's positive over there. And if I had something positive, there's not really anywhere for it to interact here, right? That was the idea that the polar and the non-polar, right? We talked about like the oil and the water. They do not want to interact with each other, right? So this kind of explains why certain molecules won't interact with others. That's why it spent such a long time making sure that you're aware about those intermolecular forces, right? This is just some images of showing you some of the different shapes that carbons are going to be able to make. You don't need to know about these guys. It's fine if you want to go take a look at it. But again, it's just kind of visualizing the different things that we can do. Really, like, I guess if we wanted to make anything be aware, it's just because you can do like long chains, right? We can do the double bonds, right? Branching, we're able to make different branches. This is going to be shown up when we start talking about polymers. And then you're able to make these rings, right? And that's why we really specifically like carbon. It just does a lot of really crazy, funky stuff. Okay, what we got here is just where do we use carbon and why. As I mentioned earlier, these guys, the carbs, the proteins, the lipids, and the nucleic acids, you're going to need to know these guys. You're going to need to be able to identify them. And they are the most important molecules because they basically make you up, right? They literally are what you are made out of, and they allow you to exist. If we go and take a peek, we can see what elements are used in order to go and make what certain molecules. And what we can do is take a look at some of the things right here. So in the case of and actually, I'm going to go and draw a table. This table, I'm pretty sure is going to be showing up later on again, but we can kind of use this as a way for you to identify what's going on, right? So what I'm going to do, I'm going to go say a carb right here. I want to go ahead and do a protein. I want to go ahead and do lipid. And then I'm going to do nucleic acid, right? And what we can do is actually see what elements are going to be the most common within them. So we can do like, all right, carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, and maybe like drawing over on this guy. I try not to, but it is what it is. Um, Over here, we can have phosphorus and nitrogen, right? So in the case of carbohydrates, what you are going to go ahead and see in the case of a carbohydrate is that it will always have carbons, oxygens, and hydrogens. We'll go into detail about that, right? There's never going to be anything else. Carbohydrates will only have C's, O's, and H's. I'm going to go down to lipids because it's relatively similar. They'll have C's, O's, and H's only, and then some of the times they will have phosphoruses, and we'll show you that in a little bit. Okay, so we put a little star right there because it's not every single lipid has it. Some do, not all. If we go take a look at proteins, they're going to have carbs, oxygens, hydrogens. We're also going to go ahead and see nitrogens within them. And then I'm even going to put like a star right here because depending on it, like there'll be sulfur, like for disulfide bridges, and we'll show you that. And then nucleic acids, they have carbons, oxygens, hydrogens, nucleic acids that are nitrogenous bases, so they have nitrogen. They also have phosphorus. All right, so this is kind of an idea when we start to take a look at what we're seeing. This is where these elements are showing up. With that little aside out of the way, let's go ahead and take a look at this guy right here. Okay, so here's just showing monosaccharide structures, right? So monosaccharide is a carbohydrate. So what elements should we see? We should see carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen, right? And let's go see if we can see. In this long chain structure, here's carbons, there's an oxygen, and there's hydrogens, right? You're probably saying, whoa, what's supposed to be here? This is all carbons. This is what I was telling you, that we get lazy after a while and we don't draw everything because it's like, you should be able to tell there's a carbon there. This ring structure, it's the exact same thing. Basically, are we doing it as a long chain structure or a ring structure? They're both monosaccharides. Let's go and take a look at proteins because the protein is actually the next one that's on this little guy right here. So we'll use this orange, right? So we take a look. It should be carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, and we said nitrogen. Let's go take a look. All right, so we go and take a look. Our protein, here's our carbohydrate. There's our hydrogen, there's our oxygen, and then there's our nitrogen. Now, the R group, this is where that star comes into place with, because there might be some weird funky stuff that other things will be attached to it. All right, so there's your protein. All right. We'll keep on going. We'll go into, let's do the lipids next. So these are your fats. All right, we're going to take a look. They are carbon, oxygens, hydrogens, and sometimes phosphorus. In the case here, this is actually triglyceride. So if you go take a look at the black is supposed to be the carbon. The grayish is supposed to be the hydrogen. The red is going to be the oxygen. And this doesn't actually show you a phospholipid, so that's why we're not seeing the phosphorus right here. Phospholipid's on the next page. And then the last guy, the nucleic acid. Let's go get like one more color right here. Let's do like a yellow. Hopefully this is be able to see. Nucleic acid, right? Carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, phosphorus, nitrogen. Let's take a look. All right. You're probably looking at this. Where's the carbon? Right? Remember I told you that we get lazy? There's a carbon here, carbon here, carbon here, carbon here. Like carbon here, carbon here. If you don't see anything, it's like black lines converging, there's carbons there, right? So carbons are located all over the place. Where's the hydrogens? Right? Remember I said like the hydrogens are like a placeholder, like they're like fillers. So see how you have like an OH group right here and an H, and H. So these places also have H's associated with it, right? So there's probably like H over here and stuff and all sorts of nonsense. All right, we're gonna take a look at O's. Cool, easy. You can see oxygen here, all over the place. Your nitrogen, boom. The nitrogenous bases, there's your nitrogens. And finally your phosphorus, located right there. So the reason why I'm drawing this to your attention is that these elements, right, the primary ones I was telling you, hey, these are the ones you got to be aware of, plus sulfur. Just give me a heads up, sulfur is located within proteins. This is where it all is, and you are made of this stuff, right? These are the biomolecules that are making you up. So this is why we said these are the most important ones, right? We don't see iron, we don't see potassium, we don't see sodium, because they're not the primary things that you're built out of, right? You're primarily made out of lipids, carbs, proteins, and nucleic acids. Your last picture, I'm going to show you. This is going to get us to the end of the video. Is that this is going to go show you the phosphorus when it's used in certain times, right? So here's your phosphorus. Again, we said the phosphorus is located here within your nucleic acids. It's also sometimes in lipids. This guy right here, this is called a phospholipid. I mentioned the phospholipid when we were talking about water, right, and the hydrophobic interactions. So there's a phosphate group right there. That's where the phosphorus is located. But all this stuff right here, this is all the carbons and hydrogens like in there, and makes a long line of these hydrogens and stuff. I'm just not going to draw the whole thing because there's not really a point to it. If you go take a look at the chains, that's what that is right there. And then with your nitrogen, go ahead and focus on your nitrogen right now and get us to the end. Your nitrogen. Sorry about that. My microphone died in the middle of that. Anyway, that's literally the end of it at this point. So the big takeaway, the elements that keep you alive, that make you you, they're all over the place. You know, organisms are constantly consuming them, releasing them into the atmosphere, and we're just absorbing them and, you know, eating other things in order to go and get it. And that these carbs, these carbons, the oxygens, hydrogens, nitrogens, phosphoruses, like they are all necessary for your biomolecules. So that ends up doing that guy right there. If you have any questions, feel free to ask. We're going to spend some time just kind of like learning a little bit more about how these nutrients get transferred around, and we'll be good to go. Thank you, everybody. I appreciate you listening, and I will catch you on the next one.